Welcome to the first installment of our study through the book of Exodus. I'm really excited about this. We are going to spend 5 weeks in the book of Exodus. I'm only going to look at that part of the story where Israel is still in Egypt and how they escape and how God has rescued them as they go through the Red Sea. One thing that is important to know about the book of Exodus is that it's a continuation of the story that started in Genesis. One theme I would like you to keep in mind and point to is the theme of promises, the theme of promises that God has given the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Throughout Israel's history, and from the time that God has called them to be his people, he has promised them that he would give them a land. They would be numerous, and they would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. So when Genesis 50 ends, or when we get to the end of Genesis, Joseph is lying on his deathbed. And it is these promises that he has in mind when he comforts the people that is surrounding him. In Genesis 50, verse 24, Joseph says to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land. And also he repeats that when God comes to your aid, he's very certain of the fact that God will come to their aid. So these promises of God rescuing them from Israel, taking them from Egypt, taking them to their promised land, making them a big nation so that they can be a blessing to the nations. This is what they know of God. They don't know his name yet at this point, but that is what they cling to. And that is the promises that we need to keep in mind as we read through the book of Exodus, seeing how God will fulfill these promises. So when we then get to Exodus 1 verse 1, we start seeing that none of these promises have actually been fulfilled. It says in verse 1, these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each of his family. So they are in Egypt. That's not the promised land. They also are very careful to list the descendants of Jacob to make sure that everybody reading this knows that this is Israel. This is the chosen people of God. They are numbered only 70 when they arrive in Egypt. Chapter 1 verse 5 of Exodus. That does not constitute a great nation at all. And Joseph and all his brothers, the leader, the hope of Israel in Egypt, has died. So now they also don't have someone to lead them out of that country. So what we want to do is to keep an eye out for how God is fulfilling these promises. And I'm going to go through, that's the first thing we're going to mark as we go through the book of Exodus. We are going to mark all those things that only God can do. Either, as in verse 7 says, by implication, the author of the book of Exodus makes a comment. The author makes a comment in verse 7, for example. He says, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in number, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, these implications, oftentimes directly, but sometimes, like in this case, indirectly, shows God's hand and how he starts fulfilling the promise. The first of the promises is that they will be a great nation. And the fact that they were exceedingly fruitful implies that there was something divine about this multiplication. So that's the first thing that we notice in this chapter that only God can do. Then if we look at chapter 1 verse 12, it says there, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. And again, no matter what the enemy does, no matter what the Pharaoh does in order to stop this promise, God will not allow his promises to go unfulfilled, and he, even though they are plan after plan after plan made by the Pharaoh, the multiplication process just continues. Same with chapter 1, verse 17 and 18. The Pharaoh summons the midwives, tells them to kill every boy that is being born. But again, what happens here is that God made sure that even though the midwives were ordered to do that, they had a healthy fear of God. So verse 20 says, the people increased and became even more numerous. Again, God's fulfilling his promises. And something that the author now directly links to God, something that, remember, we're looking out for things that only God can do here. Verse 21, and because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Also, chapter 2, verse 2, she became pregnant. That was Moses' mom. The whole idea of about pregnancy falls together with the fact that they were, as a nation, exceedingly fruitful, which we also say every pregnancy is of God. He ordains whether someone will or will not be pregnant. We move on in the story. In chapter 2, when Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile, it was the worst news. It was the worst person to have come to find Moses in this little basket. She opened it, she saw that it was a Hebrew boy, but the one thing that was very surprising is her reaction to it. For all accounts, she was an Egyptian. She was exposed to the Egyptian propaganda against Israel. She should not have felt sorry, but that is exactly what she felt when she saw him. And to my understanding, to the way that I read this, that was something that God ordained. God gave her a heart of compassion at that moment. So I'm going to mark that as something that I think God has done, although the author doesn't explicitly say so. A further example of that compassion, that heart of compassion, she doesn't only feel sorry, she adopts Moses, which is even more bizarre. She gives the baby back to, again, to the mother, to his own mother, which is, again, in my mind, something that is godly ordained. But more than that, the Pharaoh's daughter in verse 9 gives the baby back to his mother, and she promised to pay for his upbringing. So that is a compassion above and beyond what we would have expected. And I think that is godly ordained. So we jump all the way to chapter 2, verse 24, where the author now explicitly points to God and says what God is doing. God heard the groaning of Israel even many years after that particular Pharaoh died. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham. So as we mark the things that I think only God can do, now we are going to break the story up into various sections. Now, how we break up a story like this, a big narrative, is different from how we break up, let's say, an epistle, like Ephesians, that we've done a couple of weeks. What we do in a narrative like this is that we are looking for short little episodes. Episodes that has a storyline and a little message of its own. So typically an episode would start with either new people, a new time frame being introduced, or a new geography, a new place being introduced into the story. So when we look at Exodus 1 verse 1, the focus here is on who the Israelites were when they arrived in Egypt. So I'm going to make that episode 1. Episode 1 for me starts at 1 verse 1, and it reaches some kind of conclusion. I'm going to mark conclusions this way. I'm going to say that this little circle indicates what I call a solution. Now, every story has some kind of tension or something that creates tension, either a danger or a riddle that must be resolved, something along those lines, something that must be resolved. Now, in this story, there's none of those. There's not a particular something that causes tension. All it says is that Joseph died, just tells a story, and this story has a conclusion. The conclusion is that now that the Israelites have arrived in Egypt, verse 7 says, "But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in number, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them." That's the conclusion of the story. Episode 2, then, I see it as a new story because it introduces a new king. It's a new era. It says that then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power. That introduces us to episode 2. Now what we're going to do is we are going to mark what causes tension in every story and in what way is that tension resolved, and is it resolved. So I'm going to mark all of those things in green. The tension in the second episode is in chapter 1 verse 10. "We must deal shrewdly," says the Pharaoh about the Israelites. We must deal shrewdly with them. So here, that causes anxiety, that causes tension in the story. What is he going to do? And then the tension mounts. We'll see what he does. This is the things at the top of the page, 1 verse 13. "He worked them ruthlessly. Also, he made their lives bitter." That is not something that the Israelites have experienced in Egypt before. So now it causes tension. What's going to happen? Further on, the king of Egypt said to the midwives that they should kill the boys. Okay, again, the tension starts mounting. What is going to happen? How is this going to be resolved? And in the middle of this tension, God sends midwives to crash the plans of the Pharaoh. Further on in chapter 1 verse 22, the tension mounts even more. The Pharaoh gave orders that everybody, to all of his people, every Hebrew boy must now be thrown into the river. So he's bypassing the midwives. He's putting all the forces of Egypt behind the fact that he wants to limit the numbers of the Israelites, of the Hebrew people, but he certainly doesn't want them to leave. There's some economic advantage to having the Israelites around. So this is a conclusion, but it's not necessarily a conclusion that resolves the tension. Okay, so this is what we call an open-ended conclusion, because this episode does end here. And why I'm saying it does end is because in chapter 2 verse 1 it starts with a whole new focus of new people are introduced. It's almost like the first story sort of has it's halted, it's paused for a while. So Exodus, let's call it episode 2, does not have a solution per se. The tension is not resolved yet, so it's an open-ended. So if the reader gets to that point, he really wants to read on. Okay, it's a cliffhanger. So episode 3 is introduced. Why? Because there's a man of the tribe of Levi. He marries a Levite woman. New people are introduced, and we see that they are eventually the parents of Moses. So what's happening in episode 3? What causes tension in episode 3? Well, the first thing that happens is that the mother places the child after some time among the reeds in the bank of the river Nile. Now that is exactly the place where all the other kids were thrown in to die. So this is a massive risk that the mother takes. The second thing that happens that causes tension is that Pharaoh's daughter arrives exactly at that point, at that time, for different reason altogether. But this is a real danger. This is not something that spells a very good solution to the story. She saw the basket. Oh my goodness, so the tension builds. She opens it. She sees the baby. Oh, what's going to happen? She always also recognizes that it's a Hebrew baby. And again, if you notice, where I think God has divinely acted, it breaks the tension of the story completely in verse 6. She felt sorry. That eventually we can see that God is divinely working behind the scenes to break the tension, to break the danger of this baby being killed. So in chapter 2 verse 10, this story also has a conclusion. It concludes by saying, when this child grew older, she, the mother, took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. The conclusion to this tension is that the baby is not killed, but he grows up. Now the reason I say that this is episode 4 is because there's an amount of time that now elapsed. It's a new time frame. It's the same person, same Moses, but it says one day after Moses has grown up. So a new episode introduces a new phase of life for Moses. New episode. So what we're looking for is something that causes tension. What is the tension? Well, the first order of business, the first thing that causes tension is the fact that Moses, I suppose in the previous verse, saw the hard labor. There's a beating between a Hebrew and an Egyptian. And then Moses does something that causes a whole lot of tension. Again, that puts his life in danger. He kills the Egyptian and hides him in the sand. But that's not all. The tension increases because he thought he did it in secret. But the tension mounts in verse 14, and everybody knows. Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? And then Moses realizes that his secret is not safe. The next thing that happens is that the Pharaoh hears about this. And again, Moses' life is in danger. The tension just mounts, and he tries to kill Moses. What I've forgotten to do, and I'll come back to that in a minute, is that in verse 15, that is where that episode ends. How does it end? But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. End of story. Moses didn't die. He escaped, but his life is ruined as a prince. Anyway, episode 5. Now you could say, I've put a question mark next to episode 5. You may well think, yes, all right, it's a change of focus of people. The characters changed because it now talks about a priest of Midian who had 7 daughters. But in a sense, it can as well be part of episode 4. I've made it episode 5, but just to tell you that there's an option there. You don't have to make it. It could be it could be an episode, continuation of episode 4. But again, something must cause some tension. There's no particular tension here. It just tells the story that Moses saved some of the lady shepherds from some of the men shepherds. He was commended for it, was taken in by this priest. He was given a wife. The story continues, and at the end, The story ends, that particular episode ends in Exodus 2 verse 22, where Moses explains his own situation, how he sees his life panned out. I have become a foreigner in a foreign land. That episode ends sort of on a dramatic note, a low in Moses' life, where he makes a statement about, you know what, I've started off as a prince, but this is where I'm ending up. This is how I see the episode ends. It's a sad ending where he makes a statement about where he is. The last episode talks about, it's a very short episode. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. That causes tension. They are still mistreated. They are struggling. They are oppressed in Egypt. And what do? They cry out. So again, this episode ends, this is solutions to the episode, that God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Again, it doesn't break the tension. It is no solution to the tension. And it leaves us again with a bit of a cliffhanger. It's an open-ended it's an open-ended solution to that particular short episode, but it brings God back into the story in a very direct way. All of this is to say that God works behind the scenes. He is someone who is busy fulfilling his promises. And I hope that this way of breaking down such a long story is something that you can use often. And it just helps you to think, what is the tension, what is the message of each little episode, and how does that help to show that God is working behind the scenes and that he is fulfilling the promises of growing Israel into a great nation.